Have you ever felt like something is quietly weighing down your soul? Even though they're no longer part of your life, you go about your day, you smile, you work, you move on. But deep down, there's a thread still tied to a memory, a person, a version of yourself you're not ready to release. That's emotional attachment. It's subtle and visible, but heavy. And it's not just about love or heartbreak. Sometimes we cling to pain because it feels familiar. We hold on to the past because it once made us feel alive. We stay connected to things that no longer serve us just because letting go feels like losing a piece of who we were. But what if that clinging is exactly what's stopping you from becoming who you truly are? In today's video, we're not just talking about how to let go, we're diving deep into what happens after you do, because behind every attachment you release, there's a part of yourself waiting to breathe again. If you've been feeling stuck, lost, or quietly exhausted from holding on, this is your moment to change. Let this video be your turning point. And if anything I say resonates with you, drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe for more Stoic-inspired tools to reset your mind and reclaim your peace. You deserve clarity. You deserve to come back to yourself. Let's begin. 1. Recognize what you're truly attached to. It's not just people. Most of us believe emotional attachment is always about a person, a partner. We can't forget a friend who drifted away, a parent we couldn't reach. But the truth is deeper and often more complex. What we're holding on to isn't always a person, it's what that person represented. Sometimes we stay emotionally bound to a relationship not because it was healthy or lasting, but because it made us feel something we haven't felt since. Worthy, chosen, special, seen. Emotional attachment often masks itself as love, but what it really feeds off is emotional memory. You're not always missing them, you're missing you as you were when you were with them. One of my friends went through a painful breakup that dragged on emotionally. Long after the relationship ended, everyone around her assumed she was still in love with her ex. But one day, while journaling, she had a realization. She didn't miss him at all. She missed the way she felt around him. She missed feeling beautiful when he looked at her, valuable when he held her hand, safe when he spoke kindly. And once she understood that, everything began to shift, because then the problem was no longer his, it was the version of herself she had only ever accessed through him. That's what she was really afraid of losing. When we dig below the surface of our attachments, we often find that we're not just tied to people, we're tied to identity. We're attached to how something made us feel about ourselves. That's why detachment feels threatening. Letting go of someone feels like letting go of a part of ourselves, but it's only a borrowed part. It never belonged to them in the first place. They only reflected back what was already inside us, waiting to be seen. And this is where emotional freedom begins, not when you walk away from someone, but when you stop outsourcing your self-worth to external sources, when you stop needing someone else's presence to access your own emotional clarity, when you stop being emotionally dependent on echoes from the past to feel whole in the present. This is why so many people feel empty after detaching, not because they lost something essential, but because they had been filling a quiet void with noise, and that noise often sounded like comfort. It's easy to confuse familiarity with value, to assume that just because something feels like home, it's meant to stay. But emotional self-mastery starts with recognizing the difference between what is truly you and what is simply familiar. What feels safe isn't always what serves you. Sometimes the hardest part of growth is realizing that you've outgrown the very things you once begged the universe to give you. The Stoic way doesn't demand that you stop feeling, it asks that you start questioning why you feel what you feel. It invites you to stand still with your thoughts and examine them. It dares you to ask, what am I really holding on to here? And more importantly, why do I believe I can't live without it? Often what's underneath the surface is not love, but fear. Fear of being alone, fear of not being enough, fear of facing that stillness without distraction. But when you face that stillness, something powerful happens. You begin to realize that the peace you thought someone else brought you can actually be built from within. This is emotional detachment in its highest form, not the absence of feeling, but the presence of awareness, not numbing yourself, but grounding yourself. It's the quiet discipline of saying, this version of me that I once found through someone else, I will now create on my own. And the moment you do, you begin the journey not just of letting go, but of discovering who you truly are. To stop negotiating your peace for temporary validation. One of the most dangerous emotional habits we fall into is the quiet daily act of bargaining our inner peace for a fleeting sense of being needed, seen, or approved of. You know you're tired, you know something is hurting you, and still you stay, hoping for a small dose of affection, a kind word, a gesture that makes you feel chosen again, even just for a moment. That's how emotional dependence works. It doesn't scream in your face, it whispers. It convinces you that crumbs are a feast, and that discomfort is a fair trade. If it means someone might stay, you start telling yourself, At least they replied, at least they didn't leave me completely, at least I'm still useful, but at least is not love. And silence in the face of disrespect is not strength. I remember speaking with a neighbor in her 70s once, a fiery, independent woman. She let her eldest son talk down to her, interrupt her, even disregard her needs, because in her words, he's all I have left who checks on me. Her peace had become negotiable, traded for emotional scraps, disguised as connection, and this isn't rare. So many of us live like that, staying silent not because we're weak, but because we're afraid of the emotional loneliness that might follow if we finally spoke up. This is where Stoic clarity matters. If your peace depends on someone else's mood validation or text message, then it was never peace, it was dependence. If you only feel worthy when someone praises you, or safe only when they're near, then your value has been outsourced to people who were never built to carry it. That's the problem with emotional attachment rooted in validation. It turns your self-worth into a rental, and as long as you're waiting to be chosen, you're not choosing yourself. We often fear losing people more than we fear losing ourselves. But that fear has a cost. It keeps you small, it keeps you quiet when you should speak, it keeps you accepting behavior that makes your soul shrink just so your ego doesn't feel abandoned. But here's the truth: someone giving you attention doesn't mean they're giving you respect. Someone staying in your life doesn't mean they're honoring your space. And someone remembering your birthday doesn't make up for all the days they made you question your worth. Real emotional strength, emotional self-mastery, comes from saying, I will not let anyone turn my inner world into a battleground just to keep them close. It comes from recognizing that validation is a drug, and like any drug, it always leaves you needing more. It gives you a high, but it costs your peace. And in the end, you'll realize you were never really loved for who you were, just used for how well you stayed silent. The Stoics taught that external things, praise, approval, reputation, should never be the foundation of your happiness. They can be appreciated, but never relied upon, because anything that can be taken from you should never define you. Your peace must become non-negotiable, not because you're cold, but because you're clear, not because you don't care, but because you finally care about yourself more than temporary comfort. When you reach this point, you stop explaining yourself, you stop justifying your boundaries, you stop waiting for someone to treat you better, you start treating yourself better, and let the rest fall into place. Validation might feel good in the moment, but peace feels good for a lifetime. And every time you choose yourself instead of begging to be chosen, every time you walk away from something that steals more than it gives, every time you protect your energy instead of proving your worth, you build a foundation so strong that no one else can shake it. That is not detachment, that is awakening, and it starts the moment you decide you are no longer for sale. 3. Detachment is not coldness, it's clarity. I'm not ready to cut them off, I'm not heartless. A friend once said to me with tears in her eyes, struggling with the idea of stepping away from someone who is no longer good for her, and I understood deeply. In the world we live in, detachment is often misunderstood. It's seen as indifference, as cruelty, as abandonment. Walking away quietly is often labeled as coldness. But here's the truth: sometimes walking away is the kindest thing you can do, not just for them, but for yourself. Not every relationship, not every bond, not every attachment deserves to last just because it once felt warm, and not every goodbye is rooted in anger. Sometimes it's rooted in clarity. Imagine holding on to a jacket that no longer fits. It's tight across your chest. It makes it hard to breathe. It's worn out at the seams, but you keep it because of the memories attached, because it once made you feel safe, because you're scared of what it might mean to finally let it go. So you keep wearing it. You endure the discomfort, hoping it'll somehow stretch, hoping that maybe the old feeling will return, but it doesn't. It only gets tighter. That's what emotional attachment often looks like. We cling to things long after they've stopped serving us, not because we don't see the damage, but because we fear what might happen if we face the emptiness on the other side. But detachment isn't about giving up or being cold. It's about seeing things as they're, not as you wish they would be. It's the ability to say, this no longer aligns with who I am, and act accordingly. Emotional detachment, when rooted in clarity and not bitterness, is an act of love. It's a way of saying, I care enough about my peace to stop living in confusion. It's not a wall, it's a window that allows light in, a window that lets fresh air circulate. It's about emotional clarity, knowing what belongs and what doesn't, what's real and what's built on old need, what uplifts you and what keeps you stuck in patterns of emotional dependency. Letting go is not proof that you no longer care. In many cases, it's the most respectful response to a bond that has run its course. You're not rejecting the person, you're simply refusing to live in an emotional fog any longer. And that clarity is what brings healing, because in clarity there's no room for games, there's no hunger For validation, there's no desperation to be seen. You stop begging for emotional scraps and start feeding your soul with self-respect. You stop chasing the illusion of connection and start building real emotional independence from within. Many fear that detachment will make them cold, unfeeling, or hard, but what it actually makes you is calm, centered, strong. It teaches you to love without control, to care without expectations, and to walk away when your peace is no longer respected. That is not coldness, that is emotional self-mastery, and it's powerful because when you reach that point, you no longer cling to people out of fear. You choose them out of truth. You no longer need to prove your worth. You already know it. You no longer attach out of emptiness. You connect from a place of fullness. Stoicism teaches us that peace cannot exist where there is dependency. The moment you need something to feel whole, you've given away the power to someone or something outside of yourself. But when you detach, when you reclaim your emotional space, you stop living like a guest in your own life. You come home to yourself. You live with less noise, less conflict, less pretending. And in that quiet clarity, you finally see the love that doesn't trap you, the peace that doesn't shake, the self that doesn't vanish just because someone else walks away. That's when you know detachment wasn't coldness. It was the warmest truth you've ever allowed yourself to live. For face the inner void without running from it. There are nights when everything outside is still, but your mind feels like a storm. You lie in bed staring at the ceiling, and there it is, that quiet, heavy emptiness that shows up uninvited. Nothing specific triggered it. No one said anything hurtful, yet something feels missing. It's the kind of emptiness you can't explain to others without sounding overly dramatic, and so you just carry it silently. That hollow feeling isn't sadness, it's not grief, it's the echo of having once filled your identity with something outside yourself, and now that it's gone, you're not sure who you are without it. Most people run from this feeling. They open the fridge when they're not hungry, scroll endlessly through screens, and call someone just to avoid sitting in that silence. But the truth is, the inner void is not your enemy. It's a message. A friend once told me that after ending a long relationship, he didn't miss his partner as much as he thought he would. What he missed was the feeling of being connected, the routine of waking up to a message, the security of knowing someone cared. When that went away, it wasn't the person he craved, it was the structure that made him feel relevant. That insight shook him because he realized he had never really built that emotional connection with himself. He had relied on someone else to anchor his identity, and now alone the silence felt unbearable. But here's the secret few talk about: the silence is not empty, it's full of truth. When everything is stripped away, when no one is texting back, when the distractions run out, that's when your real self speaks up. And at first it may feel terrifying because now you must face questions you've avoided for years. Who am I without their presence? What do I feel when there's no one to impress? What part of me did I outsource to someone else? Most people avoid these questions not because they're too deep, but because they're too honest. We're conditioned to fill every gap with noise, but healing requires that we make room for quiet. This is where Stoic strength begins, not in avoidance, but in presence, sitting with the discomfort, breathing through the urge to escape, and letting the void be without trying to fix it, because the void is only painful when you believe it shouldn't exist. Once you accept it as part of your journey, it transforms. It becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, you'll start to see the parts of you that were always there but drowned out by your need to feel needed. You'll see your resilience, your capacity for solitude, your ability to generate your own peace without relying on someone else's attention. That is emotional detachment at its core, not closing off, but opening inward. Too many people confuse fullness with noise. They think being surrounded, being busy, and being desired equals being alive, but a calm, grounded soul knows that stillness is not lifelessness, it's power in its purest form. You don't need to run from the void. You need to enter it like a sacred space with courage and curiosity. You'll find that what you feared wasn't the silence itself, it was what the silence revealed, but everything it shows you is something you were always meant to see. Once you stop resisting that inner emptiness, it becomes the very place from which you rebuild, a place where you no longer chase external approval to feel whole, a place where you no longer fear solitude, but honor it, and from that place you begin to discover your true self, not the self shaped by roles or relationships, but the one rooted in clarity, calm, and emotional freedom. That's the moment you stop being afraid of the void. You realize you are the light that fills it. 5. Rewrite the narrative. You are not the abandoned or the addicted. What truly breaks us is not just what happened, it's the story we tell ourselves about what happened, and that story repeated long enough becomes a prison. It becomes the lens through which we see every future possibility, every new relationship, every decision we make. It whispers, you were left behind because you weren't enough. Or if only you had done more, they would have stayed. That story might begin with pain, but over time it grows roots until you no longer remember where the wound ends and the self-perception begins. You stop being a person who went through something and become someone who is defined by it. But that narrative isn't the truth, it's just a version, and you right now have the power to write a new one. I once listened to a woman share her experience during a small support group. She had been divorced for years, but She didn't speak about her ex-husband with anger. Instead, she blamed herself, not in words that sounded cruel, but in the way she described her daily life, constantly second-guessing her worth, calling herself too much or not enough, depending on the day. Her identity had become tied to the idea that she had somehow failed at being loved. But no one gets to define your worth just because they chose to walk away. No one's departure gets to rewrite who you are unless you let it. The Stoics teach that we don't control events, but we do control the meaning we assign to them. And this is where the healing begins. You are not the one left behind. You are the one still standing. You are not the person who was too hard to love. You are the person who now gets to learn what love really is, starting with how you speak to yourself. Emotional detachment isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing not to carry a story that poisons you every time you remember it. It's about seeing the same chapter in a new light. Instead of "I was abandoned," say "that ending freed me to come home to myself." Instead of "they didn't choose me," say "I get to choose myself now." And that choice is permanent. So many people live inside roles they never consciously accepted, roles of the broken, the rejected, the addict, to someone else's approval. But none of these labels is your name. They are conditions, temporary experiences. And when you keep rehearsing them, you relive the wound instead of letting it close. You deserve more than to be a character in someone else's story. You deserve to be the author of your own. This isn't about delusion. It's about perspective. It's about choosing power over pity, agency over despair. Because when you rewrite your narrative, you don't erase the past, you reclaim it. Letting go of emotional attachment means letting go of the identity that was built around being dependent on someone else for happiness. It means you stop searching for closure from those who never gave you clarity, and instead you create your own. You begin to rebuild your emotional strength, not from what was lost, but from what survived. And the part of you that survived is stronger than you think. The part of you that's reading this right now, that's still breathing, still feeling, still hoping, that's the part that gets to start again. You don't need permission to begin. You just need to stop telling the same painful story on repeat. Every day you repeat it, you reinforce the idea that you are broken. Every time you question your worth because of someone else's absence, you give them power they no longer earn. You can end that cycle today, and it starts with a single decision to tell the truth. Not their truth, not the version soaked in shame, but yours. You are not the abandoned. You are not addicted. You are the author. Pick up the pen, rewrite the page. And this time, write from strength, write in peace, write from the clarity of knowing you never needed their approval to be whole. Discover who you are. When you let go, you've probably heard someone say, "I don't know who I am without that relationship." It's more common than we think, tying your identity so closely to someone or something that when it ends, it feels like you've disappeared with it. I once had a friend who didn't just lose his job when his company let him go. He lost himself, his confidence, his purpose, even his voice. For years, his worth had been measured in productivity, performance, and praise. But after the layoff, there was silence. No titles, no meetings, no one calling his name. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. He began to rediscover the man behind the role. He told me that the first few weeks felt like grief. He grieved the version of himself he thought he needed to be, but then slowly life started to whisper. He began waking up without the pressure to perform. He made coffee not to rush, but to enjoy. He walked without checking his phone. He wrote in journals not to be read, but to be real. No one clapped, no one noticed, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel drained. He felt still, and that stillness wasn't empty. It was honest. That's what letting go really does. It clears the noise, and in the quiet that follows, you start to see the outlines of who you are without needing to be seen. Letting go isn't about loss, it's about release, and the version of you that emerges when you stop chasing what doesn't nourish you is often the version that was buried under all the noise. We live in a culture that worships attachment, titles, relationship status, and roles, but Stoicism teaches something different. It teaches that freedom begins where need ends. When you stop needing someone to validate your worth, you begin to feel your own presence. Again, when you stop clinging to an identity shaped by others, you begin to remember the person you were before the world told you who to be. And that's not a loss, that's a homecoming. When you let go, you don't vanish, you return to a self no longer held together by dependency. You realize you don't need to be useful to someone to feel worthy. You don't have to keep something broken just to prove you're loyal. You don't need to chase love just to feel lovable. The moment you stop seeking wholeness from others, you remember you were never broken to begin with. The world might stop noticing you, but you start noticing yourself. That's the real shift, not from loneliness to company, but from emptiness to inner clarity. You begin to live lighter, not because you have less, but because you need less, and in that simplicity you regain the most powerful thing you lost along the way, your peace. You no longer wake up to impress, you no longer shape-shift to be accepted. You walk through life not trying to be chosen, but already knowing you've chosen yourself. That's not arrogance, that's alignment, that's emotional self-mastery. So when people ask, But who am I without them? The answer is simple. You are everything you've forgotten. You are stillness. Without approval, you are valued. Without applause, you are meaning. Without someone else defining it for you. And when you finally let go, not with bitterness, but with calm intention, you stop reacting. You begin creating. You stop holding on. You begin becoming. Letting go doesn't mean giving up. It means you're finally ready to meet yourself as you are not as they wanted you to be, but as the person quietly waiting inside you all along. Emotional attachment often hides behind love, comfort, or habit, but deep down it holds us back from who we're meant to become. Letting go isn't a loss, it's a conscious return to peace, a bold move toward emotional self-mastery. The moment you stop clinging to what no longer feeds your growth, you reclaim your power, you make space for clarity, for calm, and for the true self that's been buried beneath need, fear, and noise. Detachment isn't about becoming numb. It's about becoming whole. When you detach with awareness, you no longer look outside for approval, worth, or direction. You become emotionally independent. You shift from being defined by others to defining yourself. That's where the transformation begins. And it's not loud, it's quiet, steady, and deeply freeing. If this video spoke to something real in you, I'd love to hear your story. What are you letting go of? What clarity have you found through emotional detachment? Share in the comments below. Your words might be the light someone else needs. And if you want more tools to build inner peace, emotional resilience, and self-discovery, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more content rooted in Stoic emotional freedom.